What happens when one of Hollywood's brightest stars sits down for what should be a simple interview, only to find herself facing a host who seems determined to turn the conversation into a battlefield? It only took one dismissive comment about her intelligence for Margot Robbie to show the world that some lines should never be crossed, no matter how big the platform. The stage was set for what producers thought would be an entertaining evening of banter and conversation. Margot Robbie walked onto the set with her characteristic warmth, that genuine smile that had won over millions of fans around the world. She settled into the guest chair, adjusted her dress, and prepared for what she assumed would be a typical late-night interview. Greg Gutfeld sat across from her, leaning back in his chair with an expression that immediately set a different tone than anyone expected. From the very first moment, something felt off. Where most hosts would start with a warm welcome, or perhaps a compliment about a recent project, Greg opened with something else entirely. "So, Margot," he began, his voice dripping with a tone that made several audience members shift uncomfortably in their seats. "I have to ask, do you actually understand the movies you're in, or do you just show up and look pretty?" The audience went quiet. A few nervous laughs scattered through the crowd, the kind of laughter that comes from discomfort rather than amusement. Margot's smile faltered for just a second, a brief flicker of surprise crossing her face before she composed herself. She had dealt with difficult interviews before, navigated uncomfortable questions with grace and intelligence. This would be no different, or so she thought. "I think that's quite a reductive question," Margot responded, her voice measured and calm. "I'm very involved in every aspect of my work. I produce many of my films. I work closely with directors on character development, and I take my craft seriously." Greg waved, his hand dismissively, as if brushing away her words like they were nothing more than annoying flies. Sure, he said, his tone making it clear he didn't believe a word. "But let's be real here. You're not exactly known for picking intellectually challenging roles, are you? I mean, playing a doll in a toy commercial disguised as a movie isn't exactly Shakespeare." The audience's discomfort grew more palpable. This wasn't playful banter. This wasn't the kind of teasing back and forth that often happened on talk shows. This was something else. Something that felt mean, spirited, and unnecessary. Margot sat up a little straighter in her chair, her jaw tightening slightly. "The Barbie film," she said, her voice now carrying an edge that hadn't been there moments before, grossed over $1 billion worldwide and sparked important conversations about feminism, identity, and societal expectations. It was directed by Greta Gerwig, one of the most respected filmmakers of our generation. To call it a toy commercial shows a fundamental misunderstanding of what we accomplished. Greg laughed, but it was a cold sound, lacking any real humor. "Oh, here we go," he said, rolling his eyes dramatically. "Everything has to be about feminism with you Hollywood types, doesn't it? Can't just make an entertaining movie anymore. Has to have some deep message that makes everyone feel good about themselves." "Actually," Margot interjected, her patience clearly wearing thin, "entertaining people and making them think aren't mutually exclusive concepts. Good art can do both, but I wouldn't expect someone who reduces women to their appearance to understand that." The tension in the studio was now thick enough to cut. Crew members behind the cameras exchanged worried glances. The producers in the control room were frantically trying to decide whether to cut to commercial. But Greg wasn't backing down. If anything, he seemed energized by the conflict, leaning forward with a smirk that made him look less like a talk show host and more like someone spoiling for a fight. "Wow, sensitive much," Greg said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I make one little observation, and you're ready to lecture me about art and feminism. This is exactly what's wrong with your industry. Can't take a joke. Can't handle a little bit of honest criticism. You all live in your bubble and think everyone should worship the ground you walk on." Margot took a deep breath, visibly trying to maintain her composure. "There's a difference between honest criticism and being deliberately disrespectful," she said, You invited me on your show. Presumably, that means you have some interest in what I do or what I have to say. If you just wanted to insult me, you could have done that without wasting my time." "Oh, I'm sorry," Greg said, his voice saccharine and fake. "Did I hurt the movie star's feelings? Should I be more careful with the delicate flower who makes millions of dollars? Pretending to be other people for a living?" "You know what's interesting?" Margot said, her voice now calm, but with an undercurrent of steel. "You claim to value honest conversation, but the moment someone pushes back against your narrative, you resort to mockery and deflection. That's not honest. That's cowardly." The word hung in the air like a grenade that had just been thrown into the middle of the room. Greg's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of genuine anger. Several audience members gasped quietly, shocked that a guest would use such direct language. But Margot's expression remained steady, unwavering in her assessment. "Cowardly?" Greg repeated, his voice rising several notches. "You're calling me a coward? On my own show? That's rich coming from someone who reads lines written by other people for a living." "And there it is again," Margot said, shaking her head slowly. "Another deflection. Another attempt to diminish what I do, rather than address what I actually said. You asked me to be on your show, which means you presumably think my profession has some value. But the moment the conversation doesn't go your way, suddenly I'm just someone who reads lines. Which is it, Greg? Am I important enough to interview or not?" Greg leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms defensively. "I think you're taking this way too seriously," he said, though his body language suggested he was the one taking it seriously. "This is supposed to be fun, light, entertaining, but you're turning it into some kind of political statement." "There's nothing political about asking to be treated with respect," Margot replied calmly. "That's just basic human interaction. The fact that you're framing it as political says more about you than it does about me." "Oh, please," Greg scoffed. "Everything is political with people like you. You can't just exist without making it about some cause or some movement. Can't just be an actress. Have to be an actress with a message. An actress with an agenda." Margot took a slow breath, clearly choosing her next words carefully. "Let me ask you something," she said. "If I were a man sitting in this chair, would you be questioning my intelligence? Would you be reducing my work to just showing up and looking good? Or would you actually be asking me about my craft, my process, the choices I make as an actor and producer?" The question landed hard. Greg opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. The audience seemed to lean forward collectively, waiting to see how he would answer. The silence stretched out for several long seconds. "That's not fair," Greg finally said, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. "You're trying to make this about gender when it's not." "Then what is it about?" Margot challenged. "Because from where I'm sitting, you've spent this entire interview making assumptions about my intelligence, my capabilities, and my motivations. And all of those assumptions seem to be based on the fact that I'm a woman who happens to be conventionally attractive. So please, enlighten me. What is this really about, if not that?" Greg shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I'm just trying to have an honest conversation," he said, repeating his earlier claim. "I'm trying to get past the Hollywood polish and the carefully crafted public image and talk to the real person." "No," Margot said firmly. "You're trying to provoke me. You're trying to get a reaction that will make for good television. And you're willing to be insulting and condescending to get it. That's not the same as seeking authenticity." "Cowardly," he repeated, his voice rising. "You're calling me a coward? On my own show?" "I'm calling your behavior cowardly," Margot clarified. "There's a difference. You hide behind this persona of being edgy and unfiltered, but really, you're just being cruel for the sake of it. And when someone calls you out, you act like they're the problem." Greg stood up from his chair, a move that caught everyone off guard. It was unprecedented, a break from the normal flow of how these interviews went. "You know what?" he said, pointing a finger at Margot. I don't have to sit here and be lectured by someone who thinks playing dress up for a camera makes them some kind of moral authority. Margot remained seated, her composure intact, even as the situation escalated. I never claimed to be a moral authority, she said quietly. I'm simply asking for basic respect. The same respect I would give to anyone, regardless of their profession or background. Respect? Greg laughed bitterly. You come on my show, insult me, call me a coward, and then talk about respect. The hypocrisy is astounding. I came on your show expecting a conversation, Margot countered, her voice steady. What I got was a series of insults disguised as questions. You set the tone here, not me. I simply refused to sit quietly while you tried to demean me. The audience was completely silent now, every eye fixed on the confrontation unfolding before them. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was uncomfortable, raw, and real in a way that made people squirm in their seats. Some audience members looked away, unable to watch the train wreck happening in real time. Others sat frozen, mouths slightly open, unable to believe what they were witnessing. This was supposed to be a light-hearted interview segment, maybe 20 minutes of pleasant conversation and a few laughs. Instead, it had become something else entirely. Something that felt more like a public breakdown than professional television. A woman in the third row whispered to her companion, her voice barely audible, but caught by one of the boom microphones overhead. This is awful, she said. Why is he being so mean to her? Her companion nodded silently, eyes still fixed on the stage where the confrontation continued to unfold. Around them, others shifted in their seats, some looking toward the exits as if wondering whether they should leave, whether being present for this disaster made them somehow complicit in it. The energy in the room had shifted from excited anticipation to something darker, heavier, like watching a car accident in slow motion and being powerless to stop it. Greg paced behind his desk, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. His movements were jerky, agitated, like an animal in a cage looking for a way out. You think you're so much better than everyone else, don't you? He said, his voice carrying an edge of desperation now, along with the anger. You and your Hollywood friends, looking down on the rest of us from your mansions and private jets, telling us how to think, how to feel, what to believe, acting like you have all the answers just because people pay to watch you on screen. I've never told anyone how to think, Margot said, her voice firm but not raised, maintaining a level of composure that stood in stark contrast to Greg's increasingly erratic behavior. But I will absolutely stand up when someone tries to diminish me or anyone else based on their gender, their profession, or anything else. That's not being elitist. That's having self-respect. And frankly, I think everyone deserves that, whether they're famous or not, whether they're wealthy or not. Basic human dignity shouldn't be a privilege reserved for certain people. Self-respect, Greg repeated mockingly, throwing his hands up in an exaggerated gesture. Is that what we're calling it now? Looks more like arrogance to me. You can't handle that not everyone thinks you're amazing. Not everyone wants to bow down to the great Margot Robbie. Some of us see through the facade, see through the carefully managed image, and actually say what we're thinking instead of just fawning all over you like everyone else does. Margot stood up then, smoothly and gracefully, her decision clearly made. She reached for her purse, which had been placed beside her chair at the start of the interview, a lifetime ago, when things still seemed salvageable. You're absolutely right about one thing, she said, her voice clear and strong, projecting to every corner of the now silent studio. Not everyone has to think I'm amazing, but everyone, including me, deserves to be treated with basic human dignity. Something you seem incapable of providing. And I'm not interested in sitting here while you work through whatever issues you're clearly dealing with. Oh, here we go, Greg said, throwing his hands up in the air again in that same theatrical way. The dramatic exit. How very Hollywood of you. Can't handle the heat, so you're running away. This is perfect. This is exactly what I was talking about. The moment things get real, The moment someone doesn't treat you like royalty, you fold. You run. You can't take it. I'm not running from anything, Margot said, reaching down to unclip the small microphone from her dress with steady hands. I'm choosing not to participate in whatever this is supposed to be. There's a difference between running away from a challenge and refusing to engage with someone who's acting in bad faith. And that difference seems to be lost on you. Greg moved around his desk, getting closer to where Margot stood, his face flushed red with anger and frustration. You know what your problem is? He said, his voice loud enough that everyone in the studio could hear clearly, loud enough that it probably carried beyond the studio walls. You think being famous gives you the right to dictate how conversations go? You think you can just walk away whenever someone challenges you? You think you're above having to deal with questions that make you uncomfortable? Well, newsflash, princess, that's not how the real world works. In the real world, people don't get to just walk away when things get tough. Margot placed the microphone on the chair where she had been sitting, her movements deliberate and calm, each action precise and controlled, despite the chaos swirling around her. Challenging someone and being needlessly cruel are two different things, she said, her words measured and clear. I've done hundreds of interviews. I've answered tough questions, really tough questions about my work, my choices, my life. I've had real substantive conversations with people who disagree with me, who push back on my ideas, who make me think harder about what I believe. But this? She gestured around the studio with one hand, taking in the cameras, the uncomfortable audience, the hostile host. This isn't a conversation. This isn't even a challenge. This is you trying to score points by tearing someone down, and I won't be part of that. I'm trying to have an honest discussion, Greg insisted, though his raised voice and aggressive posture suggested otherwise. But you can't handle honesty. You want everyone to treat you like royalty. I want to be treated like a human being, Margot said simply. That's it. That's the bar. And somehow you can't clear it. The silence that followed was deafening. Greg stood there, his face red with anger, his mouth opening and closing as if trying to find the right words to fire back. But Margot was already turning away, already taking her first steps toward the exit. You can't just leave, Greg called after her, his voice taking on a desperate edge. We're in the middle of an interview. Margot paused, turning back to face him one last time. An interview requires two willing participants having a conversation, she said. This stopped being an interview the moment you decided insults were more important than dialogue. I'm done here. Fine, Greg shouted, his composure completely shattered now. Walk away. Run back to your bubble where everyone tells you how perfect you are. See if I care. Margot didn't respond to that. She simply turned and continued walking, her head held high, her posture showing none of the anger or hurt that she must have been feeling. The cameras followed her movement, capturing every step as she made her way toward the studio exit. Behind her, Greg stood in the middle of his set, breathing heavily, looking less like a confident host and more like someone who had just lost control of everything. This is exactly what I'm talking about, Greg said to the cameras, trying to regain some semblance of authority. This is the problem with these people. Can't handle a real conversation. Can't deal with anyone who doesn't worship them. But the audience wasn't buying it. The scattered applause he might have expected never came. Instead, there was just uncomfortable silence, broken only by a few awkward coughs and the sound of Margot's footsteps echoing as she neared the exit. Just before she reached the door, one of the producers rushed over, trying to intercede. Margot, please, the producer said quietly, though the microphone still picked it up. Can we just take a moment? Maybe we can reset and start over? Margot shook her head gently, offering the producer a small, sad smile. I appreciate that, she said. But no, some things you can't reset. Some lines, once crossed, can't be uncrossed. She pushed through the door and was gone, leaving behind a studio full of shocked faces and one very angry host. Greg stood there for a long moment, the reality of what had just happened seeming to sink in. His show had just imploded in spectacular fashion, broadcast live for everyone to see. "Well," he finally said, his voice trying and failing to sound casual, "I guess we're going to commercial break." But before the director could cut the feed, before the cameras could turn away, the damage was already done. The confrontation was over, but the impact of what had just transpired would echo far beyond the walls of that studio. Greg had pushed too hard, gone too far, and Margot Robbie had shown the world exactly what happens when someone refuses to be diminished, no matter how big the platform or how loud the voice trying to tear them down. The cameras finally cut away, but not before capturing one final image: the empty chair where Margot had been sitting, the discarded microphone resting on the seat, and Greg Gutfeld standing alone in the middle of his set, the architect of his own disaster. What started as a routine interview had devolved into something else entirely: a masterclass in what not to do when given the privilege of someone's time and attention. Greg had come into the conversation with an agenda, armed with insults and condescension, perhaps thinking that attacking a guest would make for compelling television. Instead, he had underestimated the person sitting across from him, failed to recognize that fame doesn't make someone less deserving of respect, and ultimately created a moment that would be remembered for all the wrong reasons. Throughout the entire confrontation, Margot had remained composed, articulate, and firm in her boundaries. She hadn't matched his aggression with her own. She hadn't stooped to personal attacks or cheap shots. She had simply stated her position clearly, and when it became apparent that the situation wasn't going to improve, made the decision to remove herself from it. That took strength, the kind of strength that comes from knowing your worth and refusing to let anyone diminish it. Greg, on the other hand, had revealed something about himself in those heated minutes. Behind the bravado and the confrontational persona, there was someone who couldn't handle being challenged, someone who resorted to mockery when his behavior was questioned, someone who confused cruelty with honesty. He had invited a guest onto his show, and then treated her with such disrespect that she had no choice but to leave. That wasn't edgy. That wasn't brave. That was simply bad hosting and worse human behavior. The audience members who had witnessed the exchange firsthand would carry that memory with them, along with the uncomfortable feeling of watching someone be systematically disrespected for no good reason. The crew members would talk about it for weeks, the day a major interview went completely off the rails, and viewers watching from home would draw their own conclusions about what they had just witnessed. What made the moment even more striking was the contrast between the two people involved. Margot had come prepared for a professional interview, dressed well, ready to discuss her work and engage in meaningful conversation. Greg had come looking for conflict, armed with loaded questions and dismissive comments. One person had conducted themselves with grace under pressure. The other had shown exactly who they were when given unchecked power over a conversation. The questions Margot had raised during the confrontation lingered in the air even after she left. What is the difference between honest conversation and deliberate disrespect? Where is the line between challenging someone and simply being cruel? And what responsibility do people with platforms have to use them wisely? These weren't abstract philosophical questions. They were real issues that played out in real time, with real consequences. Greg's attempts to paint Margot's exit as weakness or inability to handle criticism rang hollow to anyone who had actually watched the exchange. She had handled his criticism just fine. What she hadn't tolerated was being reduced to a stereotype, having her intelligence questioned, and being treated as if her success somehow made her less deserving of basic courtesy. Those weren't criticisms, those were attacks. And choosing not to sit there and absorb attacks isn't weakness. It's self-preservation. The show's producers faced an immediate crisis in the aftermath. How do you recover from something like this? How do you move forward when your host has just driven away a major guest in spectacular fashion? These were questions without easy answers, problems created entirely by choices that never should have been made in the first place. For Margot, the decision to leave was probably not an easy one, despite how calm and collected she appeared while making it. Walking away from a live television interview is a big deal. The kind of move that generates headlines and think pieces and endless social media discussion. But sometimes the right choice isn't the easy choice. Sometimes protecting your dignity and setting boundaries matters more than avoiding controversy. The interaction served as a reminder that fame and success don't shield people from disrespect, but they also don't obligate anyone to tolerate it. Just because someone is a public figure doesn't mean they forfeit the right to be treated with basic human decency. Just because someone agrees to do an interview doesn't mean they sign away their self-respect at the door. As the studio emptied out and people began processing what they had just witnessed, one thing became crystal clear. This wasn't a case of two strong personalities clashing in an entertaining way. This wasn't a spirited debate that got a little heated. This was a fundamental failure of professionalism and respect, a cautionary tale about what happens when someone confuses antagonism with authenticity. Greg had set out to prove something, though what exactly remained unclear. Perhaps he wanted to show he wasn't afraid to challenge Hollywood celebrities. Perhaps he thought being harsh would make him seem tough or uncompromising. Whatever his motivation, the result was the same. A guest walking off his show, an audience sitting in uncomfortable silence, and a moment that would be dissected and discussed for a long time to come. Margot, meanwhile, had proven something too, though she probably never set out to prove anything at all. She had shown that you can be successful and still demand respect. You can be famous and still have boundaries. You can be in the public eye and still refuse to accept mistreatment. These lessons mattered, especially in an industry and a culture that often expects people, particularly women, to smile and bear it no matter how uncomfortable or demeaning a situation becomes. The empty chair, the discarded microphone, the silent audience, and the flustered host all told a story that went beyond just one failed interview. They spoke to larger issues about how we treat each other, how we use power, and what we're willing to tolerate in the name of entertainment, or edge, or authenticity. They raised questions that don't have simple answers, but are worth asking nonetheless. In the end, what started as a scheduled segment on a talk show became something much bigger. It became a moment of clarity, a line drawn in the sand, a statement that some things matter more than maintaining appearances or avoiding confrontation. Margot Robbie had walked onto that set, ready for a conversation. She walked off it, having delivered a message far more powerful than anything. That could have been said in a typical interview, that dignity isn't negotiable, respect isn't optional, and sometimes the strongest thing you can do is simply refuse to participate in your own diminishment.